It's the kind of story that keeps you awake at night, not because it's filled with loud, dramatic twists, but because it quietly seeps into your thoughts long after you've heard it. Imagine a peaceful countryside, a place where people know each other's names, where days pass with little more than the sound of distant church bells or children playing in the fields. Now imagine that one of those children simply vanishes. No warning, no clear trail. And when she's found, if we can even call it that, the answers only raise darker, more unsettling questions. This is the story of Pauline Picard, a 2-year-old girl whose disappearance in 1922 would baffle her small French village and puzzle investigators for generations. It is, on the surface, a tale about a missing child. But beneath that lies something far stranger, a web of confusion, mistaken identity, and a discovery so grim it left people wondering whether they could ever truly know the truth. We're drawn to stories like these because they speak to one of our deepest fears, that a loved one could vanish without explanation, and that even when they return, they might not be who we think they are. And as we move through this case together, I want you to picture yourself there, walking along the quiet dirt roads of Brittany in the spring of 1922, hearing the whispers of neighbors and the heavy silence of unanswered questions. The events unfolded nearly a century ago, yet the mystery remains unsolved to this day. Historians, true crime researchers, and ordinary people who stumble upon this case all find themselves circling the same chilling puzzle pieces, wondering how they fit or if they ever will. Because in Pauline's story, every supposed answer leads to another question, and every detail seems to carry a shadow. Tonight, we're going to trace that shadow. We'll look at the day Pauline disappeared, the strange events that followed, and the moment everything changed when the little girl who had been lost suddenly reappeared hundreds of miles away. And yet, if that's where the story ended, it would be remarkable enough. But what came next was far more haunting. Pauline Picard was just 2 years old, a small child with a world still so new that every sight, sound, and smell seemed like a discovery. She had been born in the farming hamlet of Goues-Saint-Ludu, part of the larger commune of Plouescat in Brittany, France. To outsiders, it was a place that barely warranted a dot on the map, a scattering of stone farmhouses, open fields bordered by hedgerows, and winding dirt roads that seemed to stretch endlessly toward the sea. To Pauline, it was everything. Her parents, Auguste and Marie-Jean Picard, were hard-working farmers who had always known a life dictated by the land. The Picard farm wasn't grand, but it was theirs, a modest plot where they grew vegetables, tended animals, and battled the fickle moods of the Atlantic weather. Pauline was the youngest of several children, the one the older siblings often carried in their arms or helped feed at the dinner table. In a household always humming with activity, she was the gentle spark that brought laughter for the quieter moments. Neighbors remembered her as a cheerful, curious little girl, quick to smile and just as quick to wander toward anything that caught her eye. She had wisps of brown hair that curled at the ends, and wide, bright eyes that seemed to take in far more than anyone realized. At an age when most children are just beginning to piece together words and sentences, Pauline had already learned how to charm those around her with her warmth and innocence. Life in rural Brittany in the late 1920s was slow, almost timeless. The pace was set by the seasons, the days divided between the labor of farming and the small pleasures that made that work bearable. People knew each other's names, their family histories, and often their secrets. It was the sort of place where a child could run from one neighbor's yard to the next without anyone worrying where they had gone. In Goues-Saint-Ludu, there were no strangers, or so it seemed. For Pauline, each day was a new adventure. She would toddle behind her mother in the garden, her tiny boots pressing uneven patterns into the soil, or watch her father repair a gate, mesmerized by the steady rhythm of his hammer. The air around the Picard farm was always alive with sound, the chatter of chickens, the clink of milk pails, the call of distant gulls when the wind carried the sea's voice inland. To Pauline, it was all part of the background music of home. Her siblings were fiercely protective of her, though they didn't need to be. Not here, not in a place where everyone looked out for everyone else's children. She often trailed after them, trying to keep up with their longer strides. They would guide her carefully over uneven ground, lifting her when she grew tired, making sure she never fell too far behind. In the evenings, after the animals had been fed and the tools put away, the family would gather in the kitchen, warmed by the glow of the hearth. Pauline would sit in her mother's lap, her head resting against a soft wool sweater, half listening to the adults talk as she drifted toward sleep. She was a child untouched by fear. That was the gift, and perhaps the danger, of her upbringing. In Goaz-al-Ludu, there was no real concept of threat. No need to warn children about strangers, because strangers so rarely came. If someone passed through, it was noticed, remembered, and almost always explained. The community was small enough to be a kind of extended family, and the trust that came with that was woven into every part of daily life. Pauline loved the outdoors. Even in the chill of early spring, she would reach for her little coat and boots, ready to follow her siblings into the fields or simply wander to the edge of the yard to watch the wind sway the tall grass. She was fascinated by movement, a butterfly drifting too close, the lazy arc of a bird overhead, the slow roll of a cart down the lane. It wasn't unusual for her to wander a short distance without her parents worrying. After all, she had done it before, and each time she was found exactly where they expected, near the house, near her family, near safety. Her parents treasured these early years with her. August, though often stern with his older children, softened when Pauline clambered onto his knee. Marie-Jean would sing to her while folding laundry, her voice blending with the creak of the wooden floorboards. They could not have imagined that these ordinary days, these small, tender moments, would one day be looked back on with an ache so deep it could not be put into words. And yet, when one looks back at the details now, with the knowledge of what would come, there is a shadow that seems to stretch over them. Not because there was any sign at the time, there wasn't, but because hindsight forces a kind of cruel overlay onto memory. Every image of Pauline laughing, wandering the yard, or chasing after a chicken feels like a photograph taken just before the frame went dark. In many ways, Pauline's story begins like so many others in small, tight-knit communities. A young child, loved by her family, surrounded by familiarity and routine. A place where life was simple, and the people believed it would always remain that way. But the thing about tragedies, especially those that seem unthinkable, is that they don't give warnings. They arrive quietly, in the space between one ordinary moment and the next. And in the spring of 1922, for the Picard family, that space was about to open wide. The spring of 1922 in Brittany, France, was the kind that locals often recalled with fondness. Crisp air in the mornings, a slow warmth in the afternoons, and the scent of the ocean drifting inland. In the small farming community of Goaz-al-Ludu, life moved at a pace so steady that a single unusual event could ripple through the village for days. For the Picard family, April 6th began as any other. Pauline, their 2-year-old daughter, woke early, bright-eyed and eager to explore the outdoors. Her parents, Eve and Marie, were used to her playful independence. They lived in an open, rural area where children could roam within eyesight without much fear. Pauline had been known to wander around the yard, sometimes picking flowers or toddling towards the nearby fields to follow the family's chickens. That morning, after a simple breakfast of bread and milk, Pauline was dressed in her usual play clothes, a small blue dress, stockings, and sturdy shoes. It was just after 10 a.m. when she went outside to play, while her mother tended to household chores and her father worked nearby. 10:30 a.m. A neighbor passing by the Picard home noticed Pauline near the barn. She was crouched down, apparently fascinated by something on the ground. It wasn't unusual to see her playing alone, and no one thought much of it. 11 o'clock m. Marie called for Pauline to come in for a snack. No answer. At first, she assumed her daughter had simply wandered behind the house. But a quick glance around revealed nothing. Within minutes, both parents were outside, calling her name. The barn was empty. The fields nearby were clear. The only sound was the wind moving through the grass. The timeline from here became crucial and haunting. 11:15 a.m. Neighbors joined the search. In a village where everyone knew one another, it didn't take long for word to spread. People left their fields and kitchens, combing through ditches, sheds, and the tree line. It was said that within an hour, almost the entire community was involved. 12:30 p.m. Someone claimed to have seen a small figure walking along a narrow lane that led toward the forest. But by the time searchers reached the spot, there was no sign of Pauline. This report has been debated for decades. Was it truly Pauline, or just a child from a nearby farm? Afternoon into evening, the search intensified. Men on horseback covered wider ground, while women scoured the riverbanks. The police from nearby towns were called in. Every barn, every field, every abandoned building was checked. Dogs were brought to track her scent, but it faded abruptly a short distance from the home, as if she had vanished into thin air. And yet, there were no signs of a struggle. No discarded clothing, no footprints that led somewhere definitive. It was as though Pauline had simply stepped off the earth. By nightfall, the Picard home was filled with quiet dread. The lamps burned late, the front door left open in case she somehow returned. Marie reportedly sat by the window for hours, staring out into the dark, listening for the sound of small footsteps on the dirt path. Theories began forming almost immediately. Some whispered that a stranger must have taken her. The village was near a main road, and while it was rare for outsiders to linger, it wasn't impossible. Others believed she might have fallen into one of the many hidden water channels nearby, but repeated searches turned up nothing. There were also small, unsettling details that didn't fit neatly into any explanation. One neighbor claimed to have heard a cart rolling down the road around the time Pauline disappeared, but when asked later, they couldn't recall seeing anyone driving it. Another villager remembered a man they didn't recognize walking toward the outskirts earlier that morning. No one knew if these details were significant, or simply the human mind trying to fill the gaps. By the second day, the case drew attention from beyond the village. Local newspapers reported on the missing child, describing her as small for her age, with light hair and a shy smile. The articles painted the image of a close-knit, devastated community. The Picards themselves were described as hardworking, honest people, not the sort to be entangled in anything dangerous. For days, the search expanded further. Hills, rivers, forests, every possible hiding place was turned over. Farmers set aside their work to aid in the hunt, and even small children were told to watch for any sign of Pauline. Yet, no matter how far they looked, no one found a trace. And then, silence. By the end of the first week, the officials had no leads. The trail had gone cold almost immediately. The Picard family was left in a limbo only the families of missing children truly understand. Desperate hope battling the quiet terror of acceptance. Some villagers held on to the belief that she would be found alive. Others murmured the unthinkable, that she had been taken for reasons too dark to speak aloud. But no one, not even the most seasoned of the local police, could explain the most haunting detail of all, how a little girl could vanish, in broad daylight, just steps from her home, without leaving a single piece of evidence behind. It was this impossible nature of the disappearance that would keep the case alive in the public imagination and make what happened next, weeks later, all the more shocking. In the hours after Pauline Picard's sudden disappearance, the small rural police station in Brittany found itself thrust into a nightmare that none of its officers had anticipated. What began as a missing child report tragic, but in their minds, still solvable quickly, turned into one of the most baffling and unsettling investigations in French history. The Picard family, devastated and desperate, clung to hope that perhaps their 2-year-old had simply wandered off, maybe following a stray animal or exploring the edges of the farm. But as time passed, the tone of the search shifted from concerned optimism to a heavy, quiet dread. The initial police response was swift. Officers from the local gendarmerie arrived at the Picard farm within hours of the call. Their first step was to interview Pauline's parents, who repeated the same story over and over: how she had been playing near the house, how she had been out of sight for only a brief moment, and how, when they looked for her, she was simply gone. These early conversations revealed nothing unusual. There were no fights, no strange visitors, no known threats. It was as though Pauline had vanished into thin air. The search was immediate and thorough. Neighbors were called in to help, and soon dozens of people were combing through fields, barns, and wooded areas. Police dogs were brought in, their handlers urging them to pick up Pauline's scent. But the dog's behavior only deepened the mystery. They could follow her scent for a short distance from the house before it stopped completely, as if she had been lifted off the ground and carried away. There were no footprints, no drag marks, and no signs of a struggle. This single detail haunted the investigators from the start. The interviews expanded beyond the family. Local farmers, delivery workers, and anyone who had passed along the country road that day were questioned. Some reported seeing Pauline near the farmhouse earlier in the day. Others claimed they hadn't noticed her at all. Conflicting statements quickly emerged. A few neighbors swore they saw a dark-colored car parked along the roadside near the Picard property around the time Pauline vanished. Others insisted there had been no vehicles that day. These discrepancies, small as they were, complicated the police's timeline. Was there truly a suspicious car? Or was it just the result of a community on edge, where every memory felt magnified under the weight of fear? Evidence collection in 1922 was nothing like what we know today. There were no DNA tests, no digital surveillance, and very few forensic techniques available to rural officers. Fingerprint analysis existed, but was rarely practical in open-air crime scenes like this one. The investigators relied heavily on observation, witness accounts, and sheer persistence. They examined the Picard home and surrounding land meticulously, searching for discarded clothing, dropped items, or footprints in the soft earth. They found nothing that could be directly tied to Pauline's disappearance. Meanwhile, the press had begun to take an interest. Small regional newspapers reported on the case almost daily, painting it as a heartbreaking mystery in the French countryside. Articles often emphasized Pauline's age and innocence, her angelic face and wide eyes, a detail that both humanized the tragedy and applied quiet pressure to the police. The public wanted answers, and they wanted them quickly. For the Picard family, the attention was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it meant more people were aware of Pauline's disappearance. On the other, it invited a wave of unsolicited theories, cruel gossip, and false sightings. Then came the first bizarre lead. Roughly a week after Pauline's disappearance, police in Cherbourg, nearly 400 kilometers away, reported finding a young girl wandering alone. She was about the same age, with similar features, but she was dirty, malnourished, and wearing clothes that didn't match Pauline's last known outfit. Most strangely, she seemed unable to speak coherently and appeared dazed. A photograph was sent to Brittany, and the Picards, desperate for hope, believed it was their daughter. The police arranged for her return But the moment the child arrived in the village, quiet whispers began. Some neighbors claimed it was Pauline. Others were unconvinced. Even the Picards themselves, while initially overjoyed, later expressed doubt, noting small differences in mannerisms and physical details. But with no modern means of identification, the mystery only deepened. The case, however, took an even darker turn. Several weeks after the supposed return of Pauline, a farmer working a field not far from the Picard property made a gruesome discovery. There, hidden in a thicket, was the decomposed body of a small child. The remains were dressed in clothing identical to what Pauline had been wearing the day she vanished. Nearby lay her shoes, recognized immediately by her parents. And yet, the child's head was missing, and no trace of it could be found. This discovery threw the investigation into chaos. If this was Pauline, then who was the child they had taken in weeks earlier? If it wasn't Pauline, then where was she? Police now had two deeply unsettling questions to answer, and very little evidence to work with. The gendarmerie interviewed the farmer extensively, but he claimed to have no idea how the body ended up on his land. He suggested it must have been placed there recently, since the area had been searched early in the investigation. That comment only intensified suspicions. If the body had indeed been moved, then someone had not only taken Pauline, but had returned to the area to deposit her remains, an act both risky and chilling. Leads poured in, but proved useless. Some villagers pointed fingers at itinerant workers who passed through the area, while others accused local families of harboring dark secrets. The police followed each tip methodically, but they all ended in dead ends. Rumors of ritualistic elements began to circulate, fueled in part by the missing head, but authorities dismissed them publicly, insisting they were pursuing logical lines of inquiry. Privately, though, some officers admitted the case felt stranger than most they had worked. The man who seemed most agitated by the discovery was an elderly neighbor, known for his odd behavior. According to witnesses, he approached the Picards soon after the remains were found and made cryptic remarks about how things like this happen when the devil comes calling. Days later, he was reportedly seen wandering the fields, muttering to himself about not being able to sleep and the little one's soul. Police questioned him, but without evidence, they could not detain him. As weeks turned into months, the investigation lost momentum. Without forensics, without clear suspects, and without solid leads, the case began to stall. Media attention waned, and the search for Pauline or answers about her remains faded from the front pages. Yet, in the village, the tension lingered. Families locked their doors more tightly. Children were kept close. And the Picard farm became a symbol of both grief and unanswered questions. Looking back, it's hard not to wonder how differently things might have unfolded had the police possessed today's investigative tools. DNA analysis might have confirmed the identity of both children. Digital records could have tracked movements, and psychological profiling might have narrowed suspect lists. But in 1922, all the investigators had were conflicting testimonies, a gruesome discovery, and a family left in limbo. The unanswered questions piled up. Was Pauline taken by someone she knew? Was she killed quickly, or kept alive for days before her death? Who was the second child, and why did she resemble Pauline so closely? And perhaps the most haunting question of all, why had someone gone to such lengths to conceal, confuse, and mislead? Even now, more than a century later, the investigation stands as one of the most perplexing and unsettling cases in France's criminal history. It was a puzzle missing too many pieces, and each attempt to solve it only seemed to raise more questions than it answered. When people first hear the story of Pauline Picard, the instinctive, obvious explanation many land on is painfully simple. She was taken, carried away from her family by someone passing through, and moved far from the farm. In the chaotic weeks after her disappearance, That is exactly what most of the village whispered. A tiny child, playing unsupervised at the edge of a yard, was an easy target. An opportunistic abductor, a stranger, an itinerant worker, a passing caravan, fits neatly into the gap the Picard family suddenly faced. The idea that Pauline had been snatched, spirited away, and perhaps brought to Cherbourg explains the one dramatic fact that seemed to make sense at the time. A month after she vanished, a similar little girl was found hundreds of miles away, and desperate parents believed they had her back. If we break that mainstream theory down using the familiar triad, motive, means, opportunity, it reads as straightforward if grim. Motive, in the minds of many then and now, could be as crude as a stranger's impulse, or as complicated as a family taking a child for reasons we might never fully know. Financial gain, the perverse urge of a transient man, or, in the more speculative corners of rumor, the trafficking or sale of children. Means were available. In 1922, itinerant vendors, peddlers, and seasonal workers routinely moved between villages and ports. A small child could be carried in a cart, hidden in a sack, or placed in a vehicle bound for a town like Cherbourg. An opportunity presented itself in the truest, most human sense. A bright morning, a child at play just beyond her parents' sight, and a community that trusted its safety. Supporters of this theory point to the Cherbourg foundling as its strongest piece of evidence. When news reached the Picards that a frightened, mute little girl had been found in Cherbourg, roughly 250 to 400 kilometers away, many took it as proof the abduction theory had been true. Someone had taken Pauline a great distance and left her, or been forced to abandon her in a distant town. According to contemporary reports, when the Picards were shown the child's photograph, the mother cried out, "It is really my daughter," and the family immediately traveled to Cherbourg to claim her. That recognition, at least initially, reinforced the belief that Pauline had indeed been kidnapped and moved far from home. But there's something that doesn't quite add up. Several things, in fact. First, the Cherbourg child's behavior and circumstances were odd. She was mute at first, did not immediately respond to Breton, the Picard's language, and bore small differences that would later trouble even her own supposed family. Experts at the time suggested amnesia or shock as explanations, but those medical explanations did not satisfy everyone. Then, almost 3 weeks after the Cherbourg episode, a decomposed body dressed in Pauline's clothing was found near the Picard farm, mutilated and, heartbreakingly, missing its head, hands, and feet, and the family and authorities faced an impossible choice. Which child was truly Pauline? The discovery of the body seemed to validate a darker end to the story and undermine the so neat abduction to Cherbourg narrative. Another difficulty for the stranger abduction theory is logistics. Moving a child hundreds of kilometers without drawing attention in 1922 would have been difficult, though not impossible. Witness accounts of suspicious vehicles or strangers were inconsistent. Some villagers swore they saw a dark car. Others insisted no one unfamiliar had passed that day. The patchwork of recollections, a dark cart here, a lone peddler there, fits the psychological pattern of communities trying to stitch together meaning from fear. But it does not produce the kind of corroborated trail you'd expect if a child had in fact been transported that far. Then there's the human element. Grief changes everything. The Picard's initial certainty about the Cherbourg girl, followed by hesitation, illustrates how desperate families can conflate hope with recognition. Newspapers and the public fueled both excitement and suspicion. Sensational reporting urged readers to pick a side. For many, the simpler, more comforting narrative was that Pauline had been found and returned, and ending with a heroine reunited. For others, the discovery of the corpse near the farm made for an even crueler story. Someone may have substituted a child, or multiple tragedies had been conflated into one terrible sequence. Either way, the most obvious explanation, an opportunistic stranger snatching Pauline and taking her away, carries emotional and intuitive weight. But it also collides with inconvenient facts, the Cherbourg child's differences, the corpse found at home, the lack of reliable witnesses to a long-distance transport, and the absence of any conclusive forensic proof. So while many believe the taken by a stranger story because it fits the visible arc, disappearance, distant foundling, desperate reunion, the deeper you look, the more the outline phrase. The case's most obvious answer is compelling because it provides a villain and a sequence the mind can hold. But the mismatched evidence, the oddities in the Cherbourg child story, and the later discovery of the mutilated body mean that the simplest explanation may be incomplete, or, worse, a narrative that obscured a more complicated, far darker truth, if you'd like. We can now take the less obvious route, explore the unsettling alternatives that linger around this case, the theories that ask whether the person who knew Pauline best might also have known how to make her disappear. There's another theory about Pauline Picard's death, one that doesn't fit neatly into the official explanations, but lingers in the corners of the mind. It's the kind of theory that leaves you staring into the dark long after you've finished reading the case file, wondering if the truth is far stranger than anyone wanted to admit. This theory begins with the most unsettling element of all. The body found near Pauline's home was so badly decomposed that identification was far from certain. And yet Pauline's clothes, recognized instantly by her parents, were neatly folded beside the remains. The oddity here is almost too jarring to ignore. If an animal attack or the elements had caused her death, why would her clothing be removed and left in such a deliberate manner? And why was there no sign of those clothes being torn or weather-worn, as one would expect after weeks in the open? Some have quietly suggested that this was not Pauline's body at all, that perhaps the little girl who vanished was never actually found. It sounds impossible at first. After all, her parents were there, and they saw the remains. But the truth is, they didn't see her face. They couldn't. The body was too far gone for that. Identification was based almost entirely on the clothing. And that's where the uncomfortable thought creeps in. Could those clothes have been planted there, deliberately, to make the world believe that Pauline had been found? If so, the next question is far more disturbing. Who would do that, and why? One possibility is that someone in the area had taken Pauline, and for reasons unknown, needed to end the search without revealing where she truly was. This could have been someone known to the family, or perhaps a stranger who feared the growing attention her disappearance was attracting. By placing clothing recognizable to her parents next to an unidentifiable child's remains, the case could be closed without leading investigators any closer to the real culprit. Then there's the second eerie element, the stranger who appeared at the Picards' home shortly after the body was found. According to some accounts, a man arrived asking strange questions about the case and whether the family was certain the remains were really Pauline's. Even more chilling, he reportedly claimed to have been in Paris, where he saw a little girl who looked just like her. When pressed, his story became vague, almost evasive, and he soon disappeared from the area entirely. Could this have been nothing more than a cruel hoax? Possibly. But in the minds of some, it feels like a breadcrumb, an indication that Pauline may have been taken far from home, her identity concealed, and her case wrapped up prematurely. There's also the uncomfortable detail of how quickly authorities concluded the case once the body was found. At the time, forensic science was limited, but even so, many expected a more thorough investigation. Instead, the official stance was swift. Pauline had wandered off, died of exposure, and the remains proved it. Yet the proximity of the discovery site, only a short distance from her home, raises more questions than it answers. Search teams had scoured that exact area multiple times in the days after she vanished. How could they have missed her if she'd been there the whole time? This leads to another possibility, that the body was placed there after the searches ended. If that were the case, then someone had access to the remains, whether they were Pauline's or another child's, and made the conscious decision to put them in a spot guaranteed to be found. The intention could have been to mislead, to bring the search to a close, or to protect someone from further suspicion. When you look at all of these elements together, the folded clothes, the unidentifiable body, the stranger's visit, the missed search area, it's hard not to feel the ground shift beneath the official explanation. Could it be possible that Pauline didn't die in the fields near her home at all? Could she have been taken elsewhere, and her story silenced before the truth could surface? We may never know for certain. But in cases like this, where the facts themselves feel incomplete, the unsettling theories tend to cling the longest. And with Pauline Picard's disappearance, the idea that she may have lived beyond that April day, even if only for a short while, remains one of the most haunting possibilities of all. There comes a point in almost every unsolved case where momentum slows. Leads dry up, resources shift elsewhere, and what was once a priority fades quietly into the background. In Pauline Picard's case, that moment seemed to arrive far too soon. What began as a frantic, high-profile investigation into the disappearance of a young girl gradually gave way to silence, the kind of silence that feels heavy, like the weight of unanswered questions pressing down on everyone who cared. In the weeks following the discovery of the unidentified body wearing Pauline's clothes, police combed the surrounding fields, rivers, and woodland again and again, hoping for anything, a clue overlooked in the chaos, a witness who hadn't yet come forward. But each sweep returned the same frustrating result. Nothing. No new evidence, no new sightings, and no solid leads to explain where Pauline had been in those missing weeks, or how she had met her end. The Picard family, who had endured the agony of losing their daughter twice, once to her disappearance, and again to the grim recovery, found themselves stuck in a cycle of grief and confusion. The official narrative was unclear. Was the body truly Pauline's, despite the bizarre claims that she had been seen alive hundreds of miles away? If it wasn't her, then who was this other girl, and why was she wearing Pauline's clothes? The police could not give definitive answers, and over time, their updates became fewer and farther between. The media, too, began to lose interest. In the early days, journalists had swarmed the farm and the surrounding countryside, snapping photographs and pressing for statements. But as the story failed to develop into a neatly wrapped conclusion, the coverage thinned. Other headlines replaced Pauline's face on the front pages. For the public, attention shifted elsewhere, but for the Picards, the mystery only deepened. There were rumors, of course. In small communities, whispers can become their own kind of truth. Some said the investigation had been bungled from the start, that crucial days had been lost before police realized the gravity of the situation. Others suggested that certain leads had been deliberately ignored, perhaps because they pointed to someone influential, or because the truth was simply too unsettling. The forensic technology of the time didn't help. Without modern DNA analysis, identification relied heavily on visual recognition, dental records, and clothing. These methods were far from infallible. The result was a lingering doubt that would never quite go away. Was the mystery solved, or had everyone simply agreed to stop asking the hardest questions? By the end of that year, Pauline's name appeared less and less in official records. The file was still open, technically, but it sat on a shelf, gathering dust alongside countless other unresolved tragedies. Her parents, meanwhile, had to navigate the impossible, moving forward without closure. They kept her memory alive in small ways. A photograph in the living room, her favorite toy carefully stored away. The quiet hope that someday someone would come forward with the missing piece of the puzzle. Occasionally, tips still trickled in. A stranger claiming to have seen a girl who looked like Pauline. An anonymous letter suggesting where her body might really be found. A farmer reporting a suspicious vehicle parked near the fields the day she disappeared. But each of these threads unraveled quickly. Either they led nowhere, or they raised more questions than answers. Over time, the community learned to live with the uncertainty. But there's something about an unsolved case that never truly fades from local memory. Even decades later, older residents still recall the search parties, the sirens, the hushed conversations in the market. They still wonder whether the truth lies buried in some forgotten police file, or if it's hidden in plain sight, known by someone who has kept the secret all these years. For Pauline's family, the passing years have not dulled the ache. In interviews, they speak of her as if she could walk through the door at any moment, older now, but with the same bright eyes and playful smile. And maybe that's the most haunting part, not knowing whether to imagine her life continuing somewhere else, or to accept the grim possibility that she had been lost all along. In the end, the trail didn't just go cold, it froze solid. The questions that mattered most remained unanswered. Where had Pauline gone during those missing weeks? Who was the other girl? And why, after such a strange and unsettling discovery, did the world simply stop asking? As we close the chapter on this haunting case, it's impossible not to feel the lingering weight of unanswered questions. Stories like this remind us how fragile the truth can be, and how easily it can slip away with time. If you've heard of this case before, or if you have your own thoughts on what might have happened, please share them in the comments. Thank you for spending this time with me, exploring another of history's quiet, haunting investigations. If you'd like to hear more forgotten stories and unsolved mysteries, I invite you to subscribe. Together, we can keep these voices alive, and perhaps one day help bring them the justice they deserve.